Now that you've had a blitz lesson in modern hearing technology, we need to revisit what happens when a child is born deaf or hard of hearing, especially if their parents are hearing. By the way, this happens 90% of the time. Allow me please to amplify this statistic because it goes against our instincts, and it's a crucial reason hearing pastors of hearing parents need to know all about babies who are deaf and their needs. Only 1 time out of 10 is a baby who is deaf born to parents who are also deaf. 1 out of 10 times. The other 9 families will face a situation they probably never thought of and will likely have no idea how to proceed with. And therein lies perhaps the most important decision point in that child's life. The belief that children who are deaf should never learn sign language goes back 150 years to the Milan debacle mentioned earlier, and to the unscientific instincts and assumptions made by hearing people to this day about what people who are deaf need. To the uninformed hearing person, a cochlear implant seems like a miracle, and they can and they do improve life for many people. The problem is that for children born deaf or profoundly hard of hearing, there is an incorrect belief that lingers in the medical and educational systems that hearing aids or cochlear implants, for all practical purposes, turn a deaf child into a hearing child. Furthermore, there is a misconception that somehow hearing, even distorted hearing through hearing aids or cochlear implants, is alone the solution to all their challenges in life. Hearing parents are sometimes in denial, and they long for their children to hear and speak like they do. This may lead to rationalizing that learning sign language later, if lip reading and hearing aids or cochlear implants fail, can be a backup plan if needed. And if it was true that hearing aids and cochlear implants gave every deaf or hard of hearing child perfect hearing early in their lives, then this might be a great way to proceed. But what research has proven is that delayed, fluent exposure to language has a negative domino effect on a child's life. My husband Carl was born, as I said before, in 1956. In those days, all the professionals told hearing parents not to use sign language. Carl did not begin to learn serious sign language until he was 12 years old. In the following video, Carl shares some of his own story of life for a boy born deaf in those days. He's being interviewed by Gail Garner. My name is Gail Garner, and this is my sign name. I'm going to be talking to this gentleman now. Would you introduce yourself? My name is Carl Revilius, and this is my sign name. That's great. Carl, where and when were you born? I was born January 20th, 1956, in a hospital, forgot which one, in Wilmington, Delaware. Long time ago, when you were little, did you go to church? Did you go to Sunday school? Yeah, when I was little, my mother took me and my sister to church. Church was Bethany United Methodist Church. We need to correct that to Chester Bethel United Methodist Church in Wilmington, close to Pennsylvania. I was upset there because the teacher talked on and on. All the other children were hearing, but I was deaf. I was the only one. I was upset and crying. was your Sunday school class in the basement? Yeah, Sunday school class was in the basement. There were 2 rows, and I sat to the right. I was crying. I didn't know anything. I didn't understand about the Bible or anything. I couldn't read anything. When you first went to school, how old were you? I was 3 or 4 years old. I don't know where the school was. I remember the class, but not the school. I don't know where it was. It was 1961 or 1962. I went to Vanguard School in Pennsylvania. Never was signing allowed. Nothing. Oral always. And only. I wore hearing aids on both ears. The children who were deaf, they weren't allowed to sign. Nothing at all. So you went to 2 schools, Lexington and Vanguard. Is that right? No, my first school, I was little growing up. I don't know where it was. I remember the classroom. It was true, yes, but then I left that school. And my second school was Vanguard School in Pennsylvania. The third school was Lexington School for the Deaf in New York City. I attended the old school. They built a new building and moved the school into Queens, New York. Next was the Stirk School, the old building, which is now DSD, which is Delaware School for the Deaf. I graduated in 1975 and I am finished. So you went to 4 schools. Which one did you learn sign language? There was no sign language. None. Only oral at the, I don't know where school. I don't know. No sign language at Vanguard or Lexington. At Stirk, there was a little sign language. A little bit. Sometimes. Did the teachers use sign language? Or did you kind of sneak around with the other students using signs? Well, we were children, we were deaf, little, we would sneak around and sign. We were using the finger spelling, the ABCs. That was when I was at Lexington. There was no signed English. Not in class, nope, not allowed. We weren't allowed to sign at meals. We had to keep our hands down and try to talk. At Stirk School, did they teach you sign language? Yes, the teachers there taught me to sign. Old signing. Sometimes. I wouldn't understand a word many, many times. So you were at Stirk School during the week, but back home on the weekend. I rode the bus to Stirk School Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Saturday and Sunday, I was free. So at home on the weekends, what did you do? I rode my bike, went shopping, swam in the pool. I like to ride my bike to the park and all around that. Did your family sign with you? My family never signed with me from when I was little till I was maybe 10 or 12. My grandmother did a little sign with me. Finger spelling, ABCs only, and my brother signs the ABCs. My sister, a little bit. How did your family communicate with you? Well, family conversations I just didn't understand. They were oral. Sometimes I would say to my father, write to me on a piece of paper. Suppose you did something wrong. How did you know? Oh, I was wrong many times. At school, I didn't understand. It was all oral. I didn't understand something I was not allowed. Maybe it was written down, I don't know. The teacher would talk on and on. I didn't understand anything. I had hearing aids and people would blah, blah, blah in my ears. But I didn't understand. So, did you socialize with your family? A little bit, not much, because they used their voices. I was deaf, so what could we do? I was the only one who was deaf. Everyone in my huge family were hearing people. What could we do? They talked a lot. I just sat there staring. Well, what about at dinner with your family or Thanksgiving when everyone gets together? What did you do? I would go to my father's house to eat Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone would be sitting around the table talking. But there I am, the only one who's not participating. One Easter, again, I told my father that I wasn't going to the family gatherings anymore. He asked me why. I told him I didn't like all the family around the table talking away. My father understood and said that he would write for me what they were saying. So I decided to go to my father's house for Easter dinner. And my father wrote sometimes, and I could read what was being said. And that was good. So do you feel the best way for deaf students to make progress from now on is for them to learn ASL? Yes. Why? The teacher at Stirk School back then taught signs. For example, the sign for when. I'd look at the sign and not know what it meant. The teacher would spell it for me and I'd think, oh, that sign means when. And the same with the sign for I. Little by little I progressed, not all at once, but slowly. Well, thank you. Thank you for telling your story. Dr. Wyatt C. Hall is a postdoctoral fellow in the Clinical and Translational Science Institute at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Within the National Center for Deaf Health Research and the Public Health Sciences Department, he is researching the relationship between early language experiences and lifespan health outcomes in people who are deaf, with a focus on language deprivation and deaf health disparities. He received his undergraduate psychology degree from the Rochester Institute of Technology in 2008 and his doctorate in clinical psychology from Gallaudet University in 2014. Hall believes in research advocacy and translating empirical evidence into practice to ensure the healthy development of children who are deaf. In the following 20-minute video, part of a World of Wonder in Science lecture he gave at RIT in 2018, he connects his personal development with deaf history and sets the stage for us to understand what happens to kids who are deaf when they are denied a rich and fluent immersion in language, either visual or auditory or both, between the ages of birth and 5 years old. Keep in mind that he was born in the late 1980s. Remember, Carl was born in the mid-1950s. Each decade since 1880 has brought remarkable advances in our knowledge and in what resources are available to children who are deaf.
This quote is important. How do you feel reading that? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? We have some agreement. We have some agreement. Here, anybody else agree? What does it mean when we talk about risk, and what does that look like? Let's explore that some. Language is the foundation of all of our development. It has a ripple effect. Our development, all parts of ourselves, who we are and how we function in the world, language affects all of it. So it's not just one aspect of our life, it's everything about who we are as human beings in the world, who we are as people. So when language is disrupted, it has an effect across all domains of our life and across our entire lifespan. It affects everything. So the concern about not having language or not having enough language comes from this widespread effect. Peter has a better diagram for this, but I simplified it for our case. Now, language deprivation doesn't affect everyone. What we're talking about in this red line is some people grow up in native deaf environments, whether they're implanted or not, and it's very effective for them. There are deaf kids who grow up signing, and they have no language deprivation. But for everybody in the middle, when an implant is not 100% effective, or when exposure to sign language is delayed, that's where we see this effect. And those are the people that I'm concerned about. Does that make sense? Okay. When Dr. Jess asked me to give this talk, she said, we want to know about your journey as a scientist, how I got to language deprivation. And I thought, well, how do I explain that? And I realized I really can't tell my own story without telling the context I was born into. Because all that's happened historically before I was ever born had a huge impact on me. So I was born into this context that was critical for my own development. So let me just touch on a few items, and most of you will probably already know all these things, but I think it's important for us to set this context as I tell you more about myself. Most people know about the Milan Conference. Prior to the Milan Conference, we commonly call that period a golden age for deaf education. Why was it called a golden age? Anybody? No one knows? That can't be. Yes, say that again, please. Yeah. The language of the education system was sign language prior to this time. Deaf people grew up within the system and became teachers in that system and passed on the language and culture of deaf people through schools for the deaf. It was a great time. And then we had the Milan Conference. Milan Conference is where a change in deaf education was established and a ban on sign language was put in place in deaf education. And we often look at that as deaf disempowerment began at the Milan Conference. Our decision making was taken out of the equation. Our wisdom about the best way to teach deaf children was systematically removed from everything related to deaf education. So that's where the community often goes back to say, this is where the trouble started. These are quotes from that period of time where oralism became the dominant force in deaf education. Speech. How can you even ask how it's important? It's the value of life itself. This was the belief. Eugenics. People believed that if deaf people married and had kids, they would have deaf kids and there would be more and more deaf people and it would create a deaf class of people. A class that was separate from the rest of society. So we see language discrimination beginning there. So can you guess who all these quotes are from? They're all from one person. Alexander Graham Bell. So probably the most hated hearing person in the deaf community, I would venture a guess, possibly. The principles that he supported were to systematically rid the world of sign language. This book, The Deaf Mute Howls, have any of you heard of that book? Do other people know about that book? So I have a colleague who told me about this book. I had not heard of it. And one of the themes in that book, and it's clear, was that deaf people have an internal sense because of their experience, not only with themselves, but with their community, that they see these effects of language deprivation. And in the 1930s, when this book was written, this person talked about how he felt not having full access to that part of his brain where language should have developed. He knew, somehow he knew, he could see his own gaps, and somehow he knew it was connected to his brain development. He knew that was involved. That was 1930, these ideas were published. Now obviously, everyone probably knows, in the 1960s was the beginning of ASL being legitimized as an actual language. But it's interesting that prior to that time, people were signing fluently, and deaf already knew it intuitively that it was a language. They were using it, they were teaching with it. The wisdom was there intuitively, but it took a hearing person to legitimize it for the rest of the world. So in 1960, deaf people already knew that ASL was a language, but once I mean, this was mind-blowing for so many people who never thought to ask this question in the first place, is ASL language, when it became clear that it was and is. In 1968, I think this is an interesting, a little bit of a side point maybe, but the Bilingual Education Act was passed, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. Are you? You're aware of it? What do you know about that act? Okay, that act provided a different framework. Not because of a different learning environment of bilingualism, it affects child outcomes differently. So it was so easy that we could fit deaf kids into this framework. ASL had already been recognized as a language, but it was not included in this law. So what we see there, and what I want to emphasize, is it says equal outcomes, not equal opportunity. So if we have someone who's not native English and someone who is, when they come in to an English-speaking school, who has better outcomes? People who are already native English speakers. So they both have equal opportunities, but they don't get equal outcomes. And that's what that act really emphasized. That was the framework of the law, was that we would have equal outcomes. Okay. So the 70s saw a lot of changes. We saw the proliferation of intentional signing systems, where people were trying to invent these systems as a way to teach English to deaf kids visually. The mainstream became more common choice or more common experience for deaf children. And now, starting in the 70s, it was, who knows LRE, the least restrictive environment? What's the goal of LRE, least restrictive environment?
For people in schools to have the best opportunity to learn and reduce barriers, give them more opportunities. And yes, this was a huge change from deaf schools to more mainstream educational environments. And if they had interpreters or they don't, there weren't enough teachers and not enough interpreters either.
For disabled kids, and I'm not talking about deaf kids, I'm talking about kids with disabilities, this was a big help. They got to go to regular classrooms. Before, they were separated out and didn't get equal education, so it was great for them. But for deaf kids, there's a real argument to be made here, but it was a large debate, and I'm not going to venture an opinion, but do deaf kids have socialization? Do they have communication in a mainstream classroom? Is it really the least restrictive environment? Those are questions that weren't really asked. A few people really wanted me to show some baby pictures, so that's me in the middle. Now you know what I look like. I was born in an interesting time. Cochlear implant clinical trials had begun just prior to when I was born. But then when I was 2 years old, Deaf President Now, DPN happened. So that's a real dichotomy. I was born in the middle of these forces pulling in two directions. So when you talk to me about my journey, this is really where my journey began, in the middle of this social political struggle. Do deaf people have a right to language? Do deaf people have a right to self-determination? What does it mean to be deaf? That's what I was born into, this complicated, messy context. It was a messy time. So in 1990 or 91, thereabouts, I went into a mainstream school. I was born in Washington, D.C., interestingly enough. And my parents, once they were born, they didn't know I was deaf until I was 2. But once they figured that out, what happened, it was a classic mom dropped the pot behind me and I didn't move. She said, something's going on here. And so in Washington, D.C., in the middle of DPN, Gallaudet, all these things are there. My parents didn't feel like I could get a good education. At that time, I had a hearing loss. They went and looked at the school there, and I could speak some, and I had some hearing. I was maybe more hard of hearing, so they didn't feel I fit there. So they looked around D.C., and special education in D.C. at that time for deaf kids was so-so. So they decided to move back to Ballston Spa. Ballston Spa is where my grandmother lived, and so I went 45 minutes commute each way every day to go to a mainstream program in Guilderland School, in that school district. So that's where I was. And so the picture in the middle is, these are the people I grew up with. This is, again, when schools for the deaf were considered a more restrictive environment. I think today we recognize that deaf kids need more than just access to what the teacher says. But at that time, the social importance, the emotional connection between people, or even the ability to participate in extracurricular activities or sports wasn't recognized in the same way. So elementary school cochlear implants at that time became more common. My mom has said to me that if I had been born later, I probably would have been implanted. But at that time, it was still new, and they did not feel comfortable implanting me, so they didn't. So in 1995, cochlear implants were approved for kids age 2 and over. So the implant age came down. Middle school. I was an awkward kid with braces. What can I say? Kids in this last picture, the one that I showed previously, elementary school, we all hung out together, right? But by middle school, something shifted. When I was being an awkward kid with braces, I started to notice something was off about my experience with my friends. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I was too young to really understand it, but I could see it and recognize it. My mainstream program had, you know, a deaf homeroom, and then we would go out to mainstream in other classes and come back to our deaf homeroom. And that was one of the, I was one of the few of us who actually went out into those other classes. There were maybe 4 or 5 of us. Chris, would you say that's about right? Yeah. Yeah. So the other 20 or 25 of the kids stayed in that room all day in the deaf classroom. So I started to realize they were having a different experience than I was. I was going out to mainstream classes and they were staying there all day, and something was off about that, though at that age I didn't know how to describe it or how to think about it. Then my family moved to a new school district, so I didn't have to take this long commute every day. And finally I could be involved after school or be more involved in school in a variety of ways. I was lucky my parents could afford to make that kind of move. That gave me more opportunities. But the funny thing is, mainstream is supposed to be the least restrictive environment, but it created a situation where I couldn't even be involved fully in my own education. No extracurricular activities until we moved. So this last picture is high school. And that's where I really started to see something was very off between my experiences and the other kids. My deaf peers were reading at like a 2nd grade level and doing math and science at a 2nd grade level or a 3rd grade level. And I remember seeing their work on the board, and it was so simple. The math problems or the science work was elementary. I thought, how is this acceptable? I'm in high school. Like, why are they so behind? While I was in high school, cochlear implants became approved for babies 12 months and older. And then I graduated, and I came here to RIT. Now, at RIT, I worked with Peter at the Deaf Studies Lab, which was a very rich experience with me. And even in that time, we saw early language experiences were key, and we could start to see some of that. And as undergrads, we hadn't really figured out what was going on at that time, but something was off. We knew something was happening. So, and we knew it was related to language and maybe to education. So I had an interest in this area all throughout my experiences. Part of my group of friends from NTID are in this picture, and not all of them, but you might recognize a few people in there. Some of them work here now. And why I put this picture up is interesting, because when I was here at RIT, that's when I really started to experience a feeling of being included in my whole life. And I started to grow as a human, not just, you know, being a good student in the classroom, but it made me realize my identity as a deaf person. And this was a critical period for me. And I was talking with Jerry Buckley last week about the important role of NTID as a safe place for deaf kids who have grown up isolated, and they arrive here and it's their time to finally figure out who they are and everything they missed growing up. And that was a really powerful experience for me. So I graduated from RIT, and I went into the PhD in clinical psych program at Gallaudet. Now, the big reason why is because of Peter and his program. He was my first deaf role model, really, and I had someone to look up to, and I said I could be like that. So I just followed in his footsteps. So I went into Gallaudet, into the clinical psych program, and I was able to work under VL2, which is a huge lab there, and it was small when I first started, but I became involved in this toolkit project as part of VL2 that was doing testing and developing all kinds of products and gathering data about these language experiences. So again, focus on language, in this case reading. I'm still interested in language. It's reading, but it was an opportunity for me to also get exposed to research. And I said, oh, that's something I could do. So then I came back here and all clinical psychology programs require a one-year internship, and I came here to the University of Rochester. And that year was fundamental for me. I saw a talk given by Dr. Sanjay Gulati. That first slide was a quote from him, from that talk. Language deprivation syndrome that terminology was developed by him, and he gave a talk at Brown University. I wasn't there, I watched it on a live stream. And his talk really focused on what happens to kids when they grow up without language and how it impacts their language later, psychologically, and then how we see people in the psychiatric system. And these people have behavior problems not because they have a mental illness in itself. So they're not psychotic, they're not depressed, but their life is disordered, disrupted, because they don't have language to express themselves or function. And suddenly, everything I had seen in my childhood and my college experiences all made sense. This is the way that language was connected to it all. And a light bulb went off. It practically knocked me off my feet. And that was a powerful lecture for me to be able to see, because then I finally had a word to describe what I've been seeing and feeling my whole life: language deprivation. That book, The Deaf Mute Howls, talks about not having language affected this guy's brain. But we didn't have a word for it. So it was there all along. Deaf people knew it, but Dr. Sanjay Gulati gave this term to what I had experienced. So that was powerful. So then I went to University of Massachusetts Medical School, and Dr. Gulati is in Massachusetts, and there's a deaf inpatient unit at the state psychiatric hospital there, and there's only 2 or 3 units like that in the whole country. So that year was a clinical year for me, and so I got to work with these people, and I want to talk about this a little bit. This chart is from Black and Glickman, and Neil Glickman is a psychologist in Massachusetts, and he was in that same hospital for many years as the clinical psychologist there, and he saw something happening with deaf people that he didn't see with the hearing patients. The hearing people who were put into an inpatient state psychiatric mental institution were fundamentally different than the majority of the deaf people. He saw language disfluency that didn't exist in hearing people, and he called it, being language disfluent. And anyone who has disordered language, usually it's from a psychiatric cause, and so they're put, it's a sign of mental illness. Does that make sense? That's how we know what's happening psychiatrically in somebody's brain, is by their language disfluency. So they're put into places. So these deaf people were put into a psych hospital, and they had no psychiatric illness, but there was no other place to put them.
The video that I'm going to show you next is portions of a lecture by Sanjay Gulati given at Brown University in 2014. You may remember that Wyatt Hall just mentioned him, and this may be the very online lecture video that Hall referred to. Gulati is a psychologist in Massachusetts who works mostly with deaf and hard of hearing clients. He was born hearing in England, gradually lost his hearing in high school, and then learned sign language. He observed, collected evidence for, and created the term language deprivation syndrome. There is some vocabulary in this video that you need in order to understand the clip. He will use the term L1 in this video, capital L1. L1 refers to the first language that a person learns during the first few years of life. L2 then would be any second language learned later in life. BI, that's BI-BI, is short for bilingual, bicultural. This is an approach to teaching and raising deaf children that surrounds them with stimulation of every kind possible from the day they're born. It's technological devices to support or amplify what hearing they have, sign language and pictures, written and spoken English, lip reading, and very important, a sense of their intrinsic worth as fully capable human beings with their own culture. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to attribute mental states to ourselves and others. Having a theory of mind means that we can understand that others have unique beliefs, desires, opinions, feelings, etc., that may be different from our own. Having a developed theory of mind enables us to engage in daily social interactions because we can interpret the mental states of others.
Parents want their children to use their language because of the bond that that implies and the connection to the family life and the family values, and that's important. But what if the L1 is delayed? That can be difficult to learn socialization. This is a fascinating study. This is a cognitive scientist, psychologist from Italy, who compared two groups, hearing kids who spoke Italian, and then deaf kids who were bilingual and bicultural. And then she compared those also with mainstream children who had a little bit of spoken Italian and also some sign language. The researcher measured theory of mind in each of these groups, and she was shocked by the results. And I'm happy to share them. There was an ENT that she was showing these results to. The idea is to help them and explain to them how L1 is so important. The bi deaf child had very strong L1, sign language, of course, Italian sign language. The mainstream kids didn't. With cochlear implants, hearing aids, and so forth, they were able to pick up words, but their language was delayed. And the ones who had the best theory of mind were the deaf kids. They were much better than the hearing kids even. So I feel badly for the last group of kids who were mainstreamed. Another important study in Holland, in the Netherlands. Hearing kids were compared to kids with cochlear implants. The researchers themselves were shocked. No one expected this. Very strong conclusions. The kids with the implants seemed to have okay language, not terrible, but the theory of mind was very delayed, not even close to kids with regular hearing. I'm trying to think of a good way to suggest critical learning period. So a critical period for learning first language. 10 or 20 years ago we argued about that, but those arguments have more or less been settled. Now the researchers have been proving what happens in the brain. Rachel Maybury has done a phenomenal amount of research. She's an incredible person. She's been working on language and the brain for the last 30 years. Her most recent study uses fMRI, which means it's a scan of the brain, but it's a special kind of scan that can see which part of the brain is working and which isn't. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little diversion, so my apologies to the interpreters. People think, where is language in the brain? Well, the vision is in the back of the head, in the back of the brain. So if you're looking at something, it goes through your eye sockets and somewhere to the back of your brain. So of course it makes sense then that sign language would be in the back of your brain, right? And spoken language is in the left temporal lobe. So that's interesting that sign language would be in a different part of the brain, but in fact, it is not. When you study people with natural fluency, native fluency in sign language, and certainly that would not be me, the language is in the left temporal lobe, in the same place that spoken language is located. What's here? This is fast, rapid processing. That's what happens in this part of the brain. So native users of language, when they see a word, they can't not read that word. It's automatic. You see a word, you read the word. It's subconscious, and that happens in the left temporal lobe. I struggle to read French, for example. Now, I'm very much aware of each and every word. I'm aware of how the words look. I know how they feel. I can see the words. It's a visual thing. And my comprehension is less accurate. I confuse words. Had I grown up in French, I wouldn't have that confusion. The words would be recognizable automatically. So that is slow processing. It's more tactile, it's more visual, more motor than what happens in the temporal lobe. I've been signing about 20 years. The sign has probably moved to slightly different parts of my temporal lobe, whereas my French, that's moved as well. Because I have an L1 that enables me to reach almost full fluency in another language. Had I not developed an L1, I would never be able to develop any kind of fluency in any other language. Now, Rachel is a very neutral, very scientific, ethical researcher. And this is a statement that she came up with. And I quoted her exactly. I find it very compelling. If you don't have an L1, you have brain damage. Why did people think signs were somewhere in the back of the head? They were confusing it. Excuse me. There is visual stimulation, and obviously that visual stimulation registers in the back of the head, but language is a whole different thing, and it registers in the temporal lobe. Now, in the very same lab, people were using more sophisticated tools that allows researchers to see where the brain is growing. It's fascinating. I love these results. I'll let you read the slide and then I'll explain it. Okay, this is surprising. So in the back of the head, which we call the occipital cortex or the occipital lobe, it's part of your brain. People who were native signers had a larger or an additional amount of gray matter in their occipital cortex. And that led people who are native fluent speakers, well, it turns out they also have additional brain matter. It's folks who don't have the L1 that are missing that. So probably what this means is that kids who grow up with parents that name things, that's a chair, that's a book, and so forth. And that includes not only auditory but visual. Those types of stimuli stimulate the occipital cortex. And it grows, physically grows. Now later, if there's language deprivation, it can shrink. And if there's no stimulation whatsoever, it doesn't grow.
Now I'd like for you to hear a little from a man named Neil Glickman, who you might remember Wyatt Hall mentioned also. Glickman is a licensed psychologist in Massachusetts. He has decades of experience in cognitive behavioral psychotherapy and deaf mental health care. He's also an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts. He has written 6 books. One, Mental Health Care of People Who Are Deaf, a Culturally Affirmative Approach, was co-edited with Sanjay Gulati, whom you just met. His most recent book, published in 2019, is called Language Deprivation and Deaf Mental Health, which he co-edited along with Wyatt C. Hall. The following video is a clip from a seminar for professionals who work with kids who are deaf that Glickman gave at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in 2019.
I'm a self-contained teacher of deaf and hard of hearing kids in a day program, and I've been teaching a long time. And I think the language deprivation is real, and I think it's actually getting worse because the trends in education now, we just slap something on a kid's head and throw them out in regular ed. And I have to fight for every kid to be in my room and why they're in my room. But I feel like the trends are working against me.
Yes, and you're not alone in thinking that. And so one of the problems that comes up, you have a child in your classroom that you recognize has language delays. Now, I bet the child has attention problems. I bet the child has behavior problems. I bet the child is sometimes aggressive. I bet the child has learning problems. You bring in somebody who's not trained in deaf mental health, it's not rocket science. What diagnoses are they going to come up with? You all know. ADHD, learning disability, oppositional defiant, conduct disorder. If they're more sophisticated, they may say reactive attachment disorder. If they're more sophisticated, they may say that. But, you know, okay, maybe. So what are we going to do? Medication, behavior plans. What are the behavior plans? Consequences. Consequences. In other words, punishment. Well, in the mental health field, that is everywhere. You know, the mental health field is dangerous for deaf people. Deaf people go in the mental health system, what do they get? Medication, too much, often appropriate. Medication, too much medication is a general problem, but deaf people who are served in mental health systems, because people don't know what to do, and the only thing they can offer is medication, you get the standard things. You get people who've got pages full of diagnoses, multiple kinds of medications. The only thing people need to do, know to do, are behavior plans. And I bet that's going on in education. A child with language deprivation will look like a child with ADHD, will look like a child with a learning disability. And where's the consideration of what it means to not have adequately developed language skills? Other comments? Speaking?
So I would agree with what the previous commenter had said, and I agree with what you're saying. And I'm, a social worker, and this is only my 5th year out of school. I'm still kind of going through my trial by fire, learning how to do this. But my question, like sort of the big question, is how, as the mental health provider, do I take all this wealth of information that you're sharing with us and go back to where I work? And how does the teacher go back and communicate that this is a bigger issue? This is a more global issue. This is a program, so should be addressed program-wide. How do we make these things a priority and have these things, these issues and strategies that we need to be using, how do we make those legitimate when we go back to our jobs?
Yeah, people always ask that. In the world where nothing is accessible, nothing is adapted for deaf people, what do I do? I'm just a social worker, I don't have any power. It's always the problem. Later in the discussion, there's a slide on the LEAD-K, L-E-A-D-K initiative. That's an initiative that's being promoted all over the country to make sure, number one, that deaf children get appropriate language assessments. I think that's where you begin. You need to be able to document this person's language skills at a very early age. First year 1, you need to be able to say it. And they need to be assessments that are both of spoken language and of sign language, so that you have some data to say, look, you don't want to wait till they're 3 or 4 or 5 and they're entering school. They've already missed out on their crucial language learning years. One thing is you push for assessments. And pushing for an assessment, you'll get pushed back against that too. But it's hard to argue that there shouldn't be an appropriate language assessment. I would start there. I would try to connect also to the advocacy efforts that are going on through the people who are promoting the LEAD-K initiatives. And then we'd have to go into the world of politics and other things too. But I think the safest place to start with is saying, as a teacher, I need a better language assessment. And by the way, in the mental health field, the thing I'm pushing the most in mental health programs, I think the mark of a quality deaf mental health program is a sophisticated communication assessment. Programs that have gone beyond what the simple, he signs, we need a signer to work with him. That is, there's no excuse for that level of primitive thinking at this point in our development. We need a sophisticated language assessment, and then we need to be able to make sure that our teaching or signing teaching communication resources are appropriate for each of the people that we're working with. And that's a larger discussion, but that's where we have to go.
Next, I'd like for you to have a brief introduction to a married couple, Carol Patton and Tom Humphreys. Born in the mid-1950s, they are professors at the University of California, San Diego. Carol was born hard of hearing and grew up in Washington, D.C., surrounded by fluent ASLs. But she had enough hearing that she was able to learn how to speak. Tom, on the other hand, was born into a hearing family in a rural location and was the only deaf person in his social setting growing up. The two have fully captured deaf history and deaf experience in America with their landmark 2004 book, Inside Deaf Culture. Carol now studies linguistics around the world. Here is a brief excerpt from a talk she gave on the University of California TV network in 2014. She refers to the names of languages that are so remote, I've never heard of them, and you probably haven't either.
But maybe we're asking a different question. How much of who we are and what we know is because of our language? Those of us in this room who speak a language smaller than English, anyone here speak or did you grow up with a language other than English? Okay. You might care about this question. How much of the good life is tied to which language or languages we use? I don't know about you, but I think about this all the time, every day, in fact. I grew up using American Sign Language. I didn't learn spoken English until I went to preschool and kindergarten. Even then, I didn't really speak spoken English very well until I left the school for deaf children at age 8, and I enrolled in a school that was in my neighborhood. I enrolled in 3rd grade with hearing children who spoke only English. My parents took me out of the small school and enrolled me in this public school because I was hard of hearing. I could hear well enough to learn spoken English. I used ASL every day at school and at home, and then I remember the day I had to learn another language. I have no memory of how I learned to speak or how I learned English. I don't remember words or sentences, but oddly, I remember one thing. I remember the bus ride, traveling between home and school. It felt like a vast distance, an interminably long trip, but it was probably just 20 minutes each way. ASL, American Sign Language, is one of the largest and most widely used sign languages of the world. We estimate there may be 400,000 signers in the US and in the English-speaking parts of Canada. We don't have a way to get a better count. We can only guess how many signers there are. But it makes American Sign Language a much more commonly used language than Sami or wall peering.